Hello. I'm Chantal Wilkinson, Director of Wilkinson King Architects. I've been a member of the RIBA Awards Group and as such have been lucky to visit one of the buildings we will be hearing about today. Welcome to the Building Stories Talk. This is a new series where we celebrate RIBA award-winning buildings and invite the architects to share their experiences. We can all learn from seeing the innovation, careful thought and hard work that goes into these projects, whatever their scale. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Simon Fraser and Rachel Mundell from Lse Morrison, who will talk about the Dorothy Wadham Building. And then Lorna Edwards from Rogers, Stirk Harbour and Partners will tell us about the Centre Building at LSE. Please do send in your questions at any time for our Q&A later. The Dorothy Wadham Building at Oxford University is a new undergraduate residential quad comprising 4 individual buildings arranged around a central courtyard. With a contemporary twist, the architectural language of this student accommodation was inspired by the traditional villas along the adjacent Iffley Road. The project won a 2021 RIBA National Award and South Award. Now over to Rachel and Simon, who will pick up the story.
Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our talk about the Dorothy Wadham Building, student accommodation for Wadham College in Oxford. We've chosen to title today's talk, Sweat the Small Stuff. And you're going to hear a story about a building where every single design decision, no matter how small, was orientated around the well-being of the end user, in this case, second-year students at Wadham College. I'm going to start by sharing this photo, which indeed has nothing to do with our project, but is a photograph of a bench designed by Erik Gunnar Asplund at the Woodland Cemetery in Stockholm. In the design of the bench, Asplund has inclined it at one end, just in order that mourners can comfort one another more easily, rather than sitting facing directly out when attending a funeral at this place. And it's this small detail, this one piece of furniture design, that I think sums up an entire approach to architecture, where the well-being of the end user is really at the heart of every design decision. And this approach underpins a lot of Lse Morrison's work over nearly 40 years. And I thought it would be a nice subtext to which to discuss the Dorothy Wadham Building with you today. So Lse Morrison won this project as part of an invited competition, I think with 3 or 4 other architects on the shortlist back in 2016. Bidwell's project manager had worked with Wadham College to find this satellite site away from their main campus, which was already saturated with accommodation, so they needed to look elsewhere. Down in the southeast of Oxford, of the city, on the Iffley Road. The brief was for 135 ensuite student study bedrooms, and that would house the entire second year at Wadham, where previously second year students would have to live out in market accommodation, rental accommodation in the city. Wadham wanted to be able to offer housing to their whole second year. Lse Morrison's competition entry largely hung around this diagram, which is thinking about the typical second year student and the various communities to which they should feel a part to support their student life. So starting at the biggest outer kind of social ring, there was this desire to feel a part of Wadham College. What did it mean to be a Wadhamite? And how could our building, despite not being on the main campus, help them feel affiliated with the main college? And then coming into the second ring, thinking about where the building is actually located. Iffley Road is actually a very densely populated residential area. So bringing students, kind of parachuting them into this area, trying to think about how the building can make them work well with the local community. And then moving on to the second year, 135 students in a single cohort. They've all studied together in the previous year, their first year at Wadham. How could the building help bring them closer together and strengthen that community? And then pairing off into individual staircases where you might be passing kind of 30 to 40 people on a daily basis, down to your individual cluster flat of about 6 to 8 students sharing. So starting out of that kind of the biggest scale, if you like, how did we design the building such that the students would still feel a part of Wadham College? So the red dot is the 17th century existing quad buildings of Wadham College in the centre of Oxford, and then there's this 20-minute walk, 5-minute cycle ride down to our site on the Iffley Road. And the very first thought in our competition scheme was to look very closely at the existing campus, which you can see here on the left-hand side, 17th century stone, gable-fronted, typical kind of quad arrangement. And we brought those concepts through to our original design layout, thinking one central entrance, passing a porter's lodge, coming into a shared communal area, and then going off into a staircase to find your individual room. And I think even this really big decision in terms of the kind of structure of the accommodation made a really strong affiliation for the students with what they recognised as college life. Then looking at how the building integrated into its urban context in the location where it's actually set. And you can see here we're sort of spent a lot of time walking up and down the Iffley Road, looking at the existing fabric. We've got mapping brick colours and patterns of the various Victorian villas which lined both sides of the Iffley Road and really kind of characterised the conservation area. And you can see those up here in the top left, these kind of 3 to 4 story Victorian gable-fronted brick villas, sometimes in terraces, sometimes semi-detached blocks. And then in the top right-hand corner, you can see the what was actually on the site when the college first bought it, which is a disused petrol station and car garage. And didn't take too much research looking back through history prior to bomb damage, actually lining the Iffley Road prior to the garage being there were these semi-detached Victorian villas. So we took the opportunity to reinstate that piece of streetscape, placing our largest building along the Iffley Road, continuing this pattern of gable frontage, and then stepping down in scale for the 2 side wings of the quad as we go into the side roads, which are much smaller. You can see just existing 2-story buildings on Percy and Charles Street. And in order to break up the kind of mass of this institutional building and kind of bring it down to a domestic scale, we use this device of stepping the facade, which we'd actually seen in the villas further up the road. And you can see other kind of motifs such as the bay window, the attic story, the gable front, all kind of helped the building settle into its domestic setting. And it's this stepping along the front in particular that allowed us to open up a little bit more space to the courtyard beyond and introduced gaps between the front building and the side buildings, such that local residents are actually able to see into the quad. So we're not got this hermetically sealed quad space, which is parachuted in and alien from its surroundings. Passers-by, residents can see into the quad and the students can see out, creating interaction between them and the local community. So then stepping over the threshold into the quad, ways to make the student feel aware that they're part of a larger cohort. We had one central entrance, and the site is actually managed by a site manager who lives on site all the time, and they offer this pastoral role to the students, and it's sitting in the reception area throughout the day, and keeping an eye on kind of who's coming and going. Should they not see anyone for some time, they can kind of follow up with how they're actually doing. And there was a space in this reception area for students to go into private and to talk to the site manager if there was anything that was bothering them, for example, on that day. And then come through into a shared reception area with lockers for each cluster, so another place to meet up in the morning, have a chat before you go off to start your day. One of the key decisions in the design concept was to actually orientate the private spaces, so the bedrooms shown here in the black, outwards onto the surrounding streets, and then allow the more semi-public spaces of the kitchens and common rooms to face into the courtyard, creating kind of quite a dynamic energy across the courtyard space. And you can see that here in the plan, circulating around into your staircase, and then these kitchen common rooms projecting into the courtyard space. And this is a very early competition sketch. You can see the chap on the left signalling to his mate in a nearby cluster, getting this sense of community around the courtyard. And the finished courtyard as it is today, you can see the glazed boxes that are sticking out with Juliet balconies. You can pull back the doors and are able to communicate across the space. And this really, yes, you've got your private space of the room if you prefer to be on your own at any time, but there is then this this courtyard that's surrounded by activity, so you're never feeling alone, you're always feeling part of the community. And the most communal of all the spaces on the site is what we call the garden room, this single-storey room that opens out onto the courtyard. And this is just a flexible space that all of the students are able to use, whether it's for extra study in the evenings or watching TV together or having a party. The college just wanted this additional space that the students could relax in if they wanted to. And it also doubles up as in the summer, when the students aren't in the building, the college actually rent it out to summer schools. And so there's a catering kitchen behind these doors, and we were able to seat 150 people for bed and breakfast in the morning, and split the London Wall kind of folding screens allowed the space to split down into 3 smaller classrooms to teach for summer schools. So a really multi-use building. And I'm now going to hand over to Simon, who's going to take us for a tour inside.
Thanks, Rachel, and hello to everybody. I'm going to sort of focus more on now the living spaces and obviously the whole raison d'etre for the development, really, which was about creating the student bedrooms. And typically we've arranged this into clusters of anywhere between 3 and 7 bedrooms, which share then these common room facilities of a kitchen and living space. Each cluster then is accessed off a central core. And that's the bit really I'm going to start focusing in on detail. So we, having come through the main reception, you do enter the quad, and then your journey takes you to one of the stair cores, which has a stair and a lift in it, obviously, but it enables you in that route to pass by these common areas, which creates this sense of community and seeing who is in and who isn't out as you go in. The stair for us was a really important feature of this as you came into the building, both providing something of high quality, but also something that would enable the opportunity, if you bump into somebody, to have these sort of chance encounters, somewhere that you're not just rushing through to get to your front door. And as such, you can see in this slide, our Revit model in the top corner there, essentially we have used precast concrete, and then we have a cross-laminated timber structure in the roofscape, creating the profiling, which materially in the larger section that you can see here, we bring those material finishes to the fore so that you can enjoy those. The CLT is at the upper level, and that then is brought into as a material which winds itself down to the ground floor, creating the stair and the landing components. And the stair itself is designed as a balustrade made of CLT with the stairs and the risers cantilevering off that. And then if we look at the engineering, HRW were our engineers, and they worked closely with Hess as we got more into the detailed design. And essentially, we have landings which are spanning between the concrete sides of the core, and then we place on these prefabricated CLT components, which are that balustrade, that vertical balustrade, with the cantilevered stair steps coming off that, such that we don't need to fix them more regularly as we're going up the flights. So each flight is then dropped in. And the college had some concerns about the squeakiness of this and the deflections and what it might be with lots of students placed on it. So we built the prototype with Hess, and they were kind enough for their guys to load it up and to test that out. And you could see in that photograph on the right, the metal strap, which helps to stiffen those ends and indeed stopping all of that movement and deflection. And this then is how the final appearance is. So you could see here that we have the CLT sides, we've got the expressed underside of CLT. We've added then a stainless steel handrail, which just serves to tie those elements together very neatly and stops any sort of deflection at the spaces between them. And then we've overlaid an oak stair and tread and riser with a walnut nosing there, so for the contrasting. And then as you go up, we transition from the concrete sidewalls you can see there into the CLT, which has a slight stain to it. And we were bringing natural daylight in from the top. So one of the moves was actually to adjust the mid-landing position, and you can just see at the bottom of the photograph there of that landing, which is a grillage, which allows the daylight to pass into the level below, which obviously helps to sort of have that sense of character in that space. And if we look now more at the clusters themselves, if we look at the orange part of the diagram here, you've come in off the central stair and lift. One of the key moments for us is that we have the kitchens and shared space up front as you come into your cluster. So you can see who's in and you can make contact with them, but also, as Rachel explained earlier on, that opportunity to see beyond that and the connection to the wider courtyard and your bigger community of the student cohort. And then within the kitchen area itself, we have a very sort of neutral palette. We've introduced some elements of color with the fixtures and fittings. We have an exposed precast concrete ceiling, which we wanted to carry throughout. We had this sort of sense of wanting to see and enjoy the materials throughout all of the spaces. Another feature that we had within the clusters was to seize the opportunity of making the corridors a much nicer place to be, rather than just sort of scuttling away to your room. So by introducing daylight and also views at the ends of the corridors, meant that we created these sort of little informal spaces where equally you could break out of your room, or if you didn't want to sit in this shared space, you could sit and watch something on your phone at the ends in these locations. And then as you go up to the roofscape, we were bringing daylight in through roof lights. And you can see on this slide where we have the widening around the doors into the student rooms, and the narrowing is actually where the risers are. So that means that each of the pods, each of the rooms can be serviced without going into the students' rooms. Just to sort of coming towards the end now, briefly, a run through the design of the bedroom itself, which is obviously the most important part and where students are going to spend the majority of their time. And we spent a lot of work with the college and the steering group and the students feeding into this design so that it was precisely as people hoped to find it and found it most useful. We've designed a palette of materials using ash timber, and we wanted to incorporate those panels into becoming the doors. And so it's a sort of an armature installation really into each of the spaces. And that also led us to have loose furniture. The college is very keen on having the ability to flexibly reposition furniture within the room so that you could have your bed against the wall or coming off perpendicular. You could have your desk facing the window, or indeed against the wall as well. So some elements of movement, and which suited both the academic terms but also the summer school use too. And the process that we went through was building a one-to-one mock-up of foam core, and that's very good for us, both in terms of everybody comprehending what they're getting, but also adjusting and tweaking the ergonomics of the design, which we then converted into scale models, which gave a greater sense of the materiality and the different character of the different rooms as you move up the building, which was also very useful to inform the contractors in terms of the detailing of this. Whilst we had a Revit model, of course, everybody likes to revert to seeing things that they can feel and touch and understand much more easily. The rooms, whilst typically were sort of a 16 square meter room, we did have different provisions for twins and studios and also wheelchair accessible rooms sort of dotted around. And of course, a lot of character came as we went into the upper levels, and we had then the pitches of the roofs informing different junctions and geometries in those spaces too. And this is the end result. So you can see the window beyond there, which is openable. We have the vent panel alongside that. This is a passively ventilated scheme, and a vertical radiator just alongside that, incorporated into the joinery. And you might notice on here that the precast ceilings have actually been painted white, which was subject to one of the discussions on the college about what that should really feel like as that space. And how that room then transitions with the same kit of parts into those sort of loft areas, but becoming something more characterful with those pitches. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel and Simon. I have some questions from the audience in the chat, but first here's my own question. As architects, we spend a lot of time thinking about the building in use as part of the briefing process and right through into detailed design, as you've described. We imagine the end users occupying the building. This project deals with a wide variety of spaces from its place at the urban scale and through to the individual bedrooms. I imagine you've been back to the building since it was occupied. Have you been surprised by the way it's been used? And are there any spaces that have been even more successful than you had imagined?
Yeah, so it has been lovely going back actually, and really kind of appreciating how the students are using it. They're a lot quieter than I thought. You know, all this activity around the courtyard, actually, Oxford students tend to be extremely studious and often working in their room, or maybe it was nice to go back in the summer and see a couple of people out sitting in the sun in the courtyard space. But one thing that did surprise us, because the kitchens actually were the individual kitchens that go with the clusters, the 6-bed clusters, were a bit more generous than some colleges might tend to do if they're trying to squeeze in a lot of accommodation. Actually, in the first year, the college found that not many students were using the common room. It was often the large garden room space was often vacant because they had enough space in their cluster of 6. So we maybe made that a bit too hospitable, such that they didn't often leave and interact in the way that we may have envisaged. But there were many other uses that the college had planned for that space that I'm sure will come to fruition now that we're out of lockdown and they can start using it a lot more easily.
I'd just like to add also, we visited obviously at the ends of lockdown, and it was very sort of heartening to hear that a lot of students had stayed throughout their time having to stay in the country and enjoyed the diversity of the spaces that were provided. They weren't just stuck in their room. They could go and sit in the garden. They could use these sort of more common areas or the incidental areas. And so that sort of came over from the discussions with the Versa. Just in fact, how much people were grateful, if you like, to have the quality and thinking in those sorts of spaces.
Yeah, fantastic. So actually tested to its limit, really, you know, really.
The bubble of 6.
Yeah, well. Yeah, it looks beautiful. So I've had some questions and some very nice compliments. I cycle past, this is from Karine, I cycle past the Dorothy Wadham building often and want to congratulate the architects on the stunning building. I would love to know the specification of the brick that was used. It's lovely.
Yeah, we did do a lot of looking and quite a few projects contemporary with this one had used this brick. Actually, there's something about it that's just got a nice mixture of colours and it feels soft. It's Engels Backstein Mystique is the name of the brick.
Well remembered. Another question is from Mika. Did you have consultation with the students from the college at the briefing stage? We
had consultation with pretty much everybody from the college at some stage in the process. Yeah, there were many groups and subgroups, but certainly, yeah, I mean, Wadham is a very kind of liberal college, and they really put their students at the fore in every decision. And so, yeah, there was quite a lot of working with them. And this photo that Simon showed of the mock-up of a bedroom, that was actually squeezed. Probably didn't size it quite right, but we had to squeeze that into their sports cricket ground one evening, and all the students were invited along to give us their step into the room, into the foam board room, give us their feedback on anything they'd like changed. Or so we had quite a lot of to and froing with the students.
And another sort of question following on. So, what was the biggest challenge? This is from Will. What was the biggest challenge in designing a student accommodation?
I do think the multi-headed client and the many end users, and this kind of, certainly from a college structure, the democracy of it and wanting to consult kind of everyone at some stage, there was a lot of energy that went into those early briefing days. All fun and enjoyable, but a lot of time and energy for sure.
Yeah.
Also, we found with the steering group, they were made of fellows who were professors in engineering, and so it's quite a nerve-wracking moment where you start realizing that you're talking to people who understand about the mechanics of air movement and are challenging you and your consultant team on your approach to a passive building. So a very kind of robust and thoughtful conversations really in what is the best approach for the design.
Did that influence your thinking or your final solution, would you say?
Absolutely. Yeah, that dialogue was informing all of the details down to the thermostatic controls on radiators and, you know, how the blinds are going to work. The ergonomics, you know, were really sort of key to it. And I think what was particularly useful, obviously, is the domestic bursar brought a lot of the knowledge from the other sites that they have, the other rooms that they have, and also what the student expectations are with their rooms coming to the college afresh, really, and they're seeing what their friends have in other cities and in other universities, and it's all a bit of a melting pot, really.
Yeah, interesting. So, and on that note, there's a question from Gloria, who loves the concept design. I've seen the building from the outside and it merges beautifully with the context. My question is, what design strategies did you consider in the building to make it accessible? So that's leading on really from...
This was something that the domestic bursar was, because she'd had the challenge of converting the 17th century quads for particularly a couple of students they'd had who were in wheelchairs, the difficulty of doing that and having this clean slate to be able to start from scratch with a purpose-built new building. She was absolutely adamant that we met all of the kind of really high standards, and so there's lifts in every core, and then this kind of idea of equality, that everybody should be able to get to every part of the building and no one should be prohibited from socialising in any one part. So in particular, the lifts, level thresholds, lots of automatic doors as you're going through the building, which often architects might not be too fond of everywhere because it adds a lot of clunk to the kind of door ironmongery. But no, really pleased that it really can say that it's a very accessible building at all levels.
So just to pick up on one technical point there that Rachel raised about the doors, and there is a salto system, which means you can prop your door open if you want people to see you or in your room. You can be sociable, or if you're working, you can close it. But you know, there was quite a lot of work involved in determining how that worked in a fire. Yeah.
Okay, so I've just got one last question. This is from a question from ZMA, a question from a sustainable point of view, why use cast concrete?
We wanted to use CLT for the whole building, but because it's so cellular, student accommodation, you'd need a load-bearing wall on every partition, and then it would be very difficult in the future if you ever wanted to convert the building into something else and take out those partition walls. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think this many years on, we would probably test that harder, wouldn't we, Simon, at the outset, knowing kind of what we know now.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you so much. So I'll be asking Rachel and Simon to join us again later, but now over to our next guest, Lorna Edwards. Winning a 2021 RIBA National Award and London Award, the LSE's central building is a state-of-the-art, flexible and highly sustainable academic and teaching building which integrates two asymmetrical slab blocks with a shared podium at the heart of LSE's campus. I'll hand over to Lorna to tell us all about it.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Chantal. I think you summed the scheme up very well there, so I'm just going to dive straight in and not start at the end would be a good place. Where I am going to start is the campus. As Chantal said, the scheme is right at the heart of London. So as you can see here, this is the Aldwych. It is in a very central London location, and you can also see that a lot of the street patterns are medieval. So it's a very constrained site, and you can probably tell just about, if you follow my mouse, that a lot of the street patterns actually lead to the site and then don't go anywhere else. There are no through roads. The outline in red is the extent of the LSE campus, and the outline in orange is our building. So it's very important to put this in context in terms of where it is sited, but also how it governed some of our design decisions and how the building was actually delivered. Giving you a quick overview of the competition entry. So we won this competition in 2013. I think there were around 70 expressions of interest, which then got whittled down and our scheme won. So here are some of the key design aspects that made it the standout scheme for the judges and the LSE. So the two key principles here are the creation of a new square, which we were the only competition entry to include that, but also just the nature and the spirit of the building, which is very open and actually is inspired by and reflects the LSE's core values of collaboration, excellence and innovation. I think these are quite evocative renders that show you some of the collaboration mechanisms that we're using that you'll see actually continue into the scheme as it developed. Another key reason why we designed the building as it was to respond to the fantastic brief that the LSE set us in terms of sustainability. It was also a key reason for us winning the competition, but their brief was actually really forward thinking for the time, bearing in mind that this was 2013. So they had 6 key sustainability criteria, energy and carbon. So they actually set targets for reducing embodied carbon, which was very forward thinking at that time, not many people doing it. Materials and waste, water, biodiversity and urban landscapes, climate change adaptation certification. And this beautiful sketch really sums up some of those core principles and how we attacked the challenge and how those elements carried on through the whole of the scheme, which I will cover in a bit more detail later. So moving on to the urban and the campus response, the two diagrams on the right-hand side show the sort of the campus response. So what you'll see here on the top right-hand side is what we had before. We're presented with a situation where the LSE is a very well-known institution, but in terms of what their campus is like, a lot of people didn't really sort of know where their front door was. Their identity wasn't clear. Wayfinding was really difficult. So you've got a lot of signs, as you can see on the bottom left-hand side, sort of saying, if you want to find this building, you have to go through here, turn left, go down the stairs type thing. What we have is the site here, and there are some key routes from the Old Witch on Houghton Street, from the student centre and also to the library. And our site really sits at the confluence of all those points. So one thing that we looked at was to see whether there was any opportunity to actually free up some space as part of our design to actually really make the heart of the campus, if you like, and to improve the wayfinding and to create some spaces that the university community could really use. Just to take you through the design evolution, which I always think is quite an interesting point on projects. So the diagram is on the left is the competition model, and you can see how it evolved to the one on the right, which is actually what we submitted for planning. So the principles are more or less the same, so 2 blocks, but you'll see as we submit it for planning, the facade treatment is a lot more refined, and we've taken into account some of the materiality of the surrounding context. But you'll also see that in terms of the organisation principles, as the diagrams on the bottom show, the principles of the two different blocks and the connecting spaces that could be very flexible remained throughout. Another interesting view of how the competition scheme evolved to the planning scheme. So a more calm version of the facade, but in some ways more expressive with this double height volume that's part of the collaborative stair, which I'll describe in a bit more detail later. And we also did a lot of work on things like rationalising the cross-bracing design to use less material, and then the massing was slightly simplified. So moving back to the sort of the urban scale thing, with a contextual response. So it's important to note that the building is in the Strand Conservation Area. So how we responded to that was actually really important. So we did a lot of analysis in terms of the surrounding buildings that we had. So this building here on the left is the old academic building, which is a Portland stone building owned by the LSE, very fine details. And then the building on the right-hand side is the newer library building. And so we looked at the materiality and also the rhythm of the facades on those two buildings in particular. And that informed our contextual response. This building on Houghton Street in particular was very important from a planning point of view. So lots of discussions with Westminster on here. So you can see this is the old academic building that we were responding to, the render of what we're proposing and the finished execution. So we're looking at the rhythm and grain of the panels themselves, but also the wider structural grid, so 6 meters to 3 meters to reflect what was opposite. And then moving on to the square. So the way that we were able to create this square was to actually challenge the massing in the competition brief. So what you'll see here is the lower block, which we refer to as the Houghton block, which really responds to the heights of the buildings opposite. But then it's quite interesting looking at the viewing points of this building and looking at the surrounding buildings that we had around the site. So this is Thomas More Towers, which is part of the Royal Courts of Justice. And that was really high. So we actually did a few exercises in terms of area and realized that if we built higher, where we had high buildings next to us, and built lower, but respected the heights of the adjoining buildings, it would actually allow us to free up a lot of space to make the square, but maintain the same area overall. And this is a stacking diagram to show the different uses of the building. So the lowest two levels are entirely student, and then above that is academic levels as well. So this is the square when it's finished, and it's been incredibly popular. One thing that the students in the LSE community really wanted to see prior to us building the scheme was to have more greening and more places to meet and so on. So I think this has been really successful in terms of how it's being used. The LSE have used it for, they've erected marquees for campus orientation weeks and inaugurations and so on. It's very well-used space. Now moving into the building and talking you through some of the academic spaces and the blended learning spaces. This is a ground floor plan that shows you the learning commons. So this is the main space of the ground floor, which I'll show you some images of shortly. The LSE square, and you can see how that connects, and then the distribution of some of the more formal spaces, so the Lse Lecture Theater. In terms of what that looks like, one key thing that we've always done is in this building is to try and connect it to the outside, so plenty of natural daylight, and we use atriums and stairs as a mechanism of encouraging people to move more, which is fantastic from a wellbeing point of view, but also it encourages collaboration a lot. And these informal learning environments actually weren't a big part of the brief initially, but they became a big part of the scheme as it evolved. So a couple of views of those spaces. So this is ground floor, really strong view of the street. And then this is a space outside some of the more informal lecture theatres, and they're very well used, and it's been very beneficial for the students to have spaces that they can use between their lectures, either to work on their own or to work with their fellow students. The more flexible spaces are located higher up the building. So this is a plan of level 1, which has a series of seminar rooms, some of which are subdivisible. So you can open this room up into 80 people. Typically there are 40 with some smaller ones here. And then we have the formal Harvard teaching space here and informal learning. So to give you an idea of what these spaces look like, and also to talk to you about the LSE style lecture theatre, which was actually a design challenge in the original competition brief. So the LSE set the challenge of coming up with a LSE style lecture theatre to rival the sort of omnipresent Harvard style lecture theatre, which is a sort of horseshoe configuration for anyone who's not familiar. So we looked at a teaching room style that actually made it more collaborative. So it's catwalk style, and the presenter can sit in the middle, but it also means that students can debate, which is quite appropriate seeing as the School of Government is in this building. And that was something that the LSE really liked and has been hugely popular in use as well. And then just a couple more views of some of the more formal spaces. So 200-person lecture theatre, which is underneath the square, and then a seminar room. Moving up to the academic levels, so we have 5 academic departments in this building. It was many other departments over the evolution of the scheme, and actually whilst we were on site, the directorate decided that they wanted to take space at the top of the building. So that was a very good test of the flexibility of the scheme really early on. But what you can see here in these images is the collaborative stair, which is a mechanism of, as I said earlier, as with the student space, is getting people to move, but also to encourage those sort of chance encounters by bumping into people. It also serves as a mechanism that helps the natural ventilation strategy, and it helps bring natural daylight deep into the spaces. One thing I should add is that over 70% of this building is naturally ventilated, and the academic levels are fully naturally ventilated. There is no plan B. In terms of the academic spaces, there is a variety. So the brief started off more open plan than we ended up with. But what we have is a variety of cellular spaces, which are for the academics, and then open plan areas, which are for PhD and master's students, but also for admin staff. Given that this was a naturally ventilated building, we had to do a lot of analysis in terms of how that would work with the distribution of accommodation. I will go into that in a bit more detail later, but you can also see here that they have great views out. So there's always a fantastic connection with the outside. And this is a view of an open plan space on the right and a cellular space overlooking one of the terraces. In terms of amenity space, the LSE have a great tradition of occupying as much of their roof terraces as they can. This was also something that we wanted to do with our scheme, and wherever we can, we have made the terraces accessible, and we've created plenty of greenery, which is fantastic for just in the amenity in itself, but also from a wellbeing perspective, given how centrally located this building is. But it was also fantastic for increasing biodiversity and the ecological value on the site. All of the rainwater is collected and used for irrigation and so on. It's a really pleasant place to sit out in. So diving into some of the environmental design aspects in more detail, I think it's really interesting to consider how things have evolved and how they progressed from the outset and how they translated into the finished product. So that one really fundamental thing with this scheme is that we maximise the passive principles as much as possible. So things like looking at the orientation and massing on the site. So another reason that we kept this building low was so that we could make use of shading from the adjacent buildings, but also in terms of how we orientated the buildings. So we made sure that most of the facades were not facing directly south, so that there would not be so much solar gain on these. We set natural ventilation as a strategy very early on. That was also quite essential for us in terms of user control, so giving the occupants the control of their own spaces so that they can control their own levels of comfort and acoustics. Also fantastic for natural daylighting, but the fundamental thing that works with the natural ventilation and this passive strategy is it very much is a fabric first principle, which I will come on to. Due to the constrained location of the site, renewables was actually quite a challenge. So we have done what we can. So we have the two main things in terms of renewable strategy are PV roof array, but then also we have a biofuel tank, engine that sits underneath the square, and that's fueled by waste from the cosmetics industry. So we did a lot of work on the facade design, and these diagrams show how we went about that. So obviously with the lower block, as I said, it's overshaded by the adjacent buildings. So in terms of solar requirements, that was much easier, but where we've gone higher, obviously that's going to be a lot more exposed. So we did an enormous amount of work with our engineers, Chapman BDSP, in terms of what that facade system would look like. So these are some analysis in terms of the amount of solar exposure, both with and without shading, that helped inform the design proposal. With that, and as I hinted at earlier, how the spaces inside were arranged was really critical. So the LSE had lots of absolutely fantastic data in terms of how their staff and indeed students occupy the spaces. So again, Chapman BDSP were able to model in a lot of detail occupancy patterns and therefore heat gains for different types of uses. So that analysis really helped us to look at the layouts for each department, and it also helped us set a set of spatial rules, if you like, for where you could put different types of spaces. So cellular spaces in the middle, high occupancy spaces on the end, and to help the natural ventilation strategy work, it's essential to have leave-out spaces to allow through ventilation of that building. It's worth adding that also every time a department changed, we had to run this analysis again. So there was an enormous amount of work that went into this, but every time it changed, it did make it easier in terms of updating the layout because we already knew the principles and the rules. To support the natural ventilation strategy, the fabric first principle was really key. So a really high performance facade. This is an overview of some of the key factors of that. So the key things being sensible ratio of solid to glass, large opening windows in each of the offices, and bookends that have increased ventilation. But in terms of the module, each facade bay is based on a single bay. So it has the large panel and a solid panel, and it works for open plan, but also for cellular. And the high level unit here is on a BMS control so that it can be automatically opened if it's overheating, but then if an occupant comes into the room, it closes and they then have the option to open it themselves. So a very sophisticated BMS system, which was a challenge. And then here's some examples of the fin design that we looked into. So lots of analysis on that, and some more views of what the facades are like. So this is the external shading with the internal skin. So you can start to see some of the solid to glass ratio. This is what it looks like in terms of the mock-ups. So we did a lot of mock-ups and the finished product on site. Just to very quickly end on where that actually left us. I think it's very interesting to compare this to current industry benchmarks and why it's always important to consider the time at which a building was actually conceived. So in terms of operational carbon, we managed to reduce it by 41%. I think if we had been able to do more with renewables, we would have been able to hit today's targets. Air source heat pump technology and so on has moved on a great deal since we did this building, which started in 2013. But also in terms of embodied carbon point of view, we reduced the embodied carbon by 35% from the benchmark, which, considering today's targets are seeking 40%, is not bad. What is interesting though is that the final figures are more or less where today's benchmark is considered. So that just shows how things move quickly, but again, also technology and industry and what people are able to deliver for you has moved on substantially. And also one thing that's interesting with this building is the time at which it was tendered during Brexit, which had some implications for costs, which did affect how we procured things. And I'll end finally on this fantastic view of the student atrium. So this is looking down, you can see some of the seminar rooms on the left, one of the terraces on the right, and just how those spaces and volumes are connected together. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lorna. That was great. Before, well, I think we might just go straight to audience questions. I had one, but we'll just go straight to a quick question from Hussein, which is just leading on from the environmental strategy and saying, would you add anything 9 years on? Or what would you do differently?
That was a very good question. I don't think we would do anything differently in terms of the holistic passive principles, because I think those are, that's always where you should start with a project. I think what we probably would do differently is some of the more active strategies. So I think, in terms of what we could do with plant, that would be different now. So I think we would, that's what we would look at. But I think we're very proud of the holistic strategy and would stand by that, and it's working very well.
Brilliant. So some questions now about the actual spaces. So Lucy's asking, how has the strategy for the shared spaces changed the interaction of the users?
Well, one thing that's been really interesting is that the students in particular, it's been hugely popular with them. The LSE run surveys of their client, if you like, so their students, they run surveys in terms of popularity, and the LSE building, the centre building rather, always comes out top. And one reason is it's somewhere for them to meet with their friends, and in terms of the academics, I think that's also been true as well. When they're using the space, you can see people sort of talking to each other across spaces. But certainly from a student point of view, it's been very popular, and it's great to see them gather and doing work together in a way that they maybe didn't do before.
And just Sarah's asking, what references did you draw on to the LSE seminar room, and what inspired the final design?
That's a very good question. We looked at various, so there was lots of, and obviously nothing exactly the same, but in terms of things that you could take points of reference from, there's some really good references in Australia, particularly at the University of Sydney. So we looked at some of them. And it was mainly just taking the key principles of different teaching styles in terms of how you could adapt that and what slight tweaks you could make to make it a more collaborative style.
Brilliant. Well, we're quite short of time, so I'd like to bring back Rachel and Simon. Thank you, Lorna. Hi. That'd be really interesting from everybody. I've got one general question for you, which is, in the current climate of rising prices of commodities and building materials, the cost of projects is becoming very challenging. Can you share any insights about realising a building project with value engineering while keeping the integrity of the design?
Shall I start, seeing as I refer to it in my talk? I mean, our project did come under a lot of cost pressure because of the time that we were doing it. So it was in the run-up to the Brexit referendum and then afterwards. So as an example, the cost of our cladding package escalated by millions of pounds overnight because it was coming from a European contractor. So my main tip on that would be is you as the architect and indeed with your engineers have the clear vision of what the product is. And I think it's always good when you do the value engineering as a team. But I think if the design team come up with the principles and the ideas first and then go to the QS and the contractor, I think that's always good, because otherwise it's quite common to get QS-led value engineering, which really does chop away at some of the key principles. But if you kind of are very proactive about it and think about, okay, if we swapped this material, if we change this module on the cladding as an example, then you have a lot more control and it's much truer to the vision that you set out with.
That's true. Simon and Rachel are actually muted.
Maybe I would just add to that. One of the things that we're increasingly encountering is where that source material is coming from, and that's very interesting, both in terms of embodied carbon, and it's not just the journey it's making, but actually what the setup is in the factory and how it too is generating its energy. So it's getting a much more richer tableau in terms of defining. So trying to utilize locally sourced materials is going to be sort of more of a feature, I think, for the buildings that we're looking at, not least for the reliability of that supply chain, but also enabling, this country to begin to produce more manufacturing materials themselves and relying less on Europe. And I think that's also becoming more prevalent, really, from what we're seeing.
That's true. Can I ask just one last question? Is what lessons have both practices learned? But obviously, through all of your work that you've been doing, which you'll apply to future projects. Anything? Anything you learned?
Well, I don't mind jumping in. well, keep talking to your clients. I mean, I think it's probably true for Simon and Rachel as well, but both of these projects, there was an enormous amount of consultation with the clients. And whilst that's particularly prevalent and true to certain typologies, I think it's also relevant to perhaps more commercial projects as well, is having an open dialogue amongst your team. So that's the design team and the client, and your contractor always yields the best results. If you're open and upfront and you discuss any of the issues as a group, it always yields a better result in my view.
Good advice.
Rachel?
Certainly. Well, just from my point of view, this was one of the largest projects that I'd kind of ran on site, and I kind of went in with quite a gung-ho attitude, maybe with the contractor kind of as a woman, kind of determined to sort of make my stamp. And I think actually next time I'd be a lot kind of calmer, collaborative, less kind of bombastic probably in those early stages, because of the importance of that founding relationship, really, that first moment when you get on board with the contractor and having them on your side.
Very honest and interesting. Thank you. Well, I think that's it for today. Many thanks to our special guests, Rachel and Simon from Allies and Morrison, and Lorna Edwards from Roger Sturt Harbour & Partners for their really interesting presentations. Remember, Building Stories will be back next Tuesday with another live digital talk. It's a real global event headed up by Nicola Dupisani from Stonewood Design, who will join us with an array of architects and designers, some even calling in from South Africa, to tell the story of gardening at the Newton, Somerset. You can pick up tickets by following the link in the chat. Goodbye.